I'll tell you something similar to what Joel did, but maybe with a slightly different focus. So my goal is also to evolve artificial intelligent robots, and I hope that we are someday able to evolve not the typical robots we see today, but robots that more closely resemble the more complex artifacts that we see in nature, like robots that look like these kind of animals, maybe artificial brains, that are more closely resemble the brains that we have. And so it's the same goal that I want to harness what natural evolution produced in artificial systems to create things of great complexity. And so there are two goals in this research. One is we're trying to understand by building, so by kind of replicating the process, by kind of seeing what things produce this complexity, like with Joel's novelty search algorithm, for example. We can maybe understand also what made evolution work in nature and get some biological understanding of certain phenomena that are hard to study directly in the natural system. And the other applications, of course, engineering applications. So once we unlock those secrets of evolution in nature, then we can probably create more complex robot, but also more complex other artificial structures that have a lot of different components that have to kind of work together. So I'm quickly going to repeat some things that Joel said, but to show that what I do has a slightly, so they're different. To make artificial evolution work better, there are two different complementary streams. So one is to make it more open-ended, what the novelty search algorithm does. And the other part, what I mostly work on, is to work on how can we represent the problem to the computer so that the computer can best work with it and create complex structures. So I'm going to, in this very simple example of a table, I'm going to show you how there are different kind of representations that you can use to run this artificial evolutionary process, and the pros and cons maybe of different representations. So let's say we want to evolve a table. So a simple representation of a table would be that you have your genome, so this is your artificial DNA, and each leg of the table you can represent with a different number. So this is the length of this leg, this is the length of this leg, and so on. And then the other thing you specify is the width and length of the table. And then you can imagine by just randomly changing some numbers, I can generate different kinds of tables. So this is what Joel talked about before, that you have some, that your children look similar to you, but they look maybe slightly different. So by doing this, from this parent, I can generate a population of, in this case it's 3. Normally in these algorithms you have 100, 200, 300 individuals. So now I have a generation of different tables. And then with the traditional, more objective-driven algorithms, you would just score them. So depending on how good you think they are. So for example, in the case of the table, I want to score them how stable they are. So this table is the worst table because it's very unstable, and this might be a little better, and this is the best. So then I delete the tables that I don't want, and I select those as the parents for the next generation, and then through mutations and crossover, I repeat this process over and over again until I have a table design that satisfies what I want from the table. And so there are different ways of doing this in the computer, and different ways of representing the table. One way that I showed you before is to represent it what we call a direct encoding, which just means that you have in your artificial DNA, you have one variable for each part of the table. So each leg of the table is specified by one independent variable. Of course, what would happen if I then mutate this string? Often I would get a table that's not very regular because there's no coordinated effects. But this is not really how it works in nature. You don't often see humans where one arm is really long and the other arm is really short, for example, or where one finger is really large and the other ones are really small. So if you have these mutations in nature, normally they're coordinated. So somebody might have long legs or short legs, but it's often not the case that you have one side of your body is really large and the other one is really small. So maybe this is not the best artificial DNA representation that we can think of. Another representation that we could think of in this case of the table, which is could be where one parameter influences multiple different parameters. So this is more similar to how it works in nature, that certain parts of our DNA don't just make this finger, but they also make this finger and this finger and this finger. So a really simple example of this, we call those generative encodings, could be where I have one parameter and that describes just the length of all these legs together. And then if I change that parameter through a mutation, then what I would get is, for example, a smaller table, but it's coordinated. So one mutation creates a smaller or larger table, but all these tables are still kind of useful. But this is also a very simple representation, and this, of course, very much restricts the kinds of tables that you could get. So you could never, with this representation, you could never get a table that maybe is not as regular. Here's another example of a colleague of ours that represents this very well, like the difference between these direct encodings and these generative encodings, and he evolved more complex tables. So in this case, each one of these blocks in the table is represented by a different gene. So you get tables that don't look very regular. They're not symmetric. They don't look like anything that we see in nature. Because evolution has to invent every little piece of this table separately. It cannot reuse certain parts like our DNA can reuse. Our DNA just had to discover one side of the body and then could reuse the same for the other side of the body. And here we have an example of a generative encoding where you have an artificial DNA that actually allows you to reuse certain parts. So for example, here we see a symmetric part. So evolution just had to discover this part and then it could reuse it to also make this other part. And those already start to resemble maybe more like IKEA tables than these tables to the left. So this is more the focus of my research, is more trying to find different kinds of ways to represent them to make it easier for the artificial evolutionary algorithm to create things that are very complex. And so these are some of the properties that we want from our artificial DNA, is that we want it to be able to create things that are symmetric, where the DNA that creates this part of the body also creates, for example, this part of the body. We want it to be able to represent things that have repeating patterns, which is important if we wanted to evolve, for example, brains, because in our brains, these are cortical columns, so a specific type of neuron assembly in our brains that repeat throughout the whole brain. So we don't want to reinvent those things over and over again. We want to allow evolution to invent it once and then reuse it multiple times. Another thing that we often find in natural systems is repetition with variation. So we have all these fingers that are very similar, but then we have, for example, the thumb, which is slightly different, but also is made using the same building blocks. So really briefly, how nature does this. So nature is able to create this incredibly complex structures because it starts with a single cell that divides over and over again. So while this division happens, it's able to use the same program in different parts of the body. So there's growth over time from a single cell to the complete body. So that's one way of how nature makes these incredible complex structures. And the other secret is that nature it uses local interactions. So each cell talks to each other, and then one cell says, okay, you're the heart cell, I'm a different kind of cell. And through these two factors, nature is able to build this complexity. But in a computer, and I'm not going to go into too much detail exactly how we do it, but in the computer we try to make it a little simpler, so you don't have to go through this whole process of local interaction and chemicals interacting with each other. So we kind of abstracted all this stuff away and made the only thing we're doing now is pretty much, and it's called Positional Panic producing networks, is that we have this kind of graph-like structure. So you can just imagine it's kind of a function. And instead of going through this growth over time or local interaction, we just evolved this structure with similar algorithms that Joel talked about before. And the trick here is that we use these different kind of functions inside this big function, and these functions represent different regularities that we see in nature. For example, we have a Gaussian function, which is symmetric, and we have a sine function, which is a repeating function. And by combining these functions in a certain way that you let evolution figure out, you can create something that is symmetric and has, for example, a repeating pattern. So it's just about, so for example, a simple example you see here, which is produced by this neural network. You have something that is symmetric along this axis and is repeating along this axis. And how it works exactly is not that important, but I'll show you some patterns that were generated by this artificial DNA representation. And these were evolved by people online collaboratively, so they worked on evolution together on this page called PicReader. And all these things started from just like random blobs, but then by having users allowing them to interactively choose where evolution should go, you actually get this incredible variety of different kind of shapes. And the important part here is that you do see that you have things that are symmetric. So evolution didn't have to discover this part and then this part, it just had to discover one wing, and then through this representation it allowed it to reuse that wing to make a symmetric body. We can see that you have repeating patterns, like in insect bodies you have a repeating pattern. You have things like, again here, symmetry, the two eyes are symmetric to each other. So you have these things that we kind of want from our artificial DNA. And later on I'm going to show you, of course we don't want to just evolve pictures because there might be, maybe that's not that exciting, but we can use the same principles to not just make pictures but also make artificial brains that should be symmetric and have certain regularities. So just to show you that it kind of, this representation captures some of the fundamental things we see in nature. Here we have a human face, and here we have a face that is evolved by this artificial encoding, and we see that it's also symmetric. Another thing, imperfect symmetry is something we often see in nature. So our heart is slightly, it's not perfectly symmetric, and we see that the artificial version can also create things that are imperfect symmetry. We can see it can create repeating patterns like the ones we see in nature, and it can create patterns repetition with variations. So all these things repeat, but they are slightly different, similarly to the thumb that is slightly different. And we can also see that you can actually get from one artificial artifact that looks more like a butterfly, over successive generations, you can actually get to something that looks more like a bat, for example. And so, as I said, it wouldn't be that exciting if we could just use this, what we call the CPPN, which is this artificial DNA to make pictures, but we can actually also use it to make artificial brains, which I'm briefly going to talk about. We can use it to make artificial flowers. We can use it to create robot behaviors, and we can also use it to create not just the brains of robots, but also the bodies of robots. And so, to quickly repeat what Joel said, this approach of evolving artificial agents, we also call this neuroevolution. So you're evolving the artificial brains of these agents. And how it normally works, you have a neural network, your artificial brain, that can do some actions. For example, it can control a robot to go left and right, and that somehow interacts with the environment, and then it gets some observation back from the environment. So in case of the biped that Joel showed, it would be that the robot is able to actuate its legs, and then what it gets back from the environment is maybe how far it walked. And that influences its chances to reproduce, and then better brains reproduce more often, and over time you get things that are better and better at performing a certain task. And just to show you some of the artificial brains that were created by this representation I talked about before, these CPPNs. So this is actually an artificial three-dimensional brain that is able to control this quadruped robot, this specific representation. We can see that it has a certain regularity to the structure that it created. So it has this pattern that repeats throughout the whole brain, and because it uses these CPPNs, it doesn't have to rediscover the structure for each neuron, but it has to discover it once, and then it can just repeat it throughout it. And it has been used for a lot of different tasks, not just quadruped robot control, but also to evolve things for RoboCup soccer, or to play things like checkers and Go, because there's also a certain regularity to if you in checkers, if I tell you how to play checkers, then I only have to tell you, for example, how to beat an opponent at this square. And as a human, then you know, okay, you can do this particular move also in other pieces of the board. And the CPPN allows also artificial agents to learn these regularities from one example. So just as a different example, where we try to evolve something that can go through this maze that Joel showed before. So at the bottom you have the behavior of the robot, and you see that after 24 generations it doesn't perform very well, so it just crashes into the wall. But over generation it gets better and better at the specific task that we wanted to perform. So after 200 generations it is able to go from the start to the end. What you see here in the middle is its artificial brain. So this is actually the brain that controls this robot navigating the maze. And what you see on top is artificial DNA. So this DNA makes this brain, and then this brain actually controls the robot to navigate. And then what we see is that it has some properties that we like. For example, this DNA is a lot smaller than the actual brain, which is important. And we see also that it gets more and more complex over time. So just as in real evolution, our DNA got more complex and the brains that it produces got more complex. So similar things can happen also in the computer. So another thing we're working on is trying to make these brains more plastic, and Jean-Baptiste is going to later talk about a different approach to make these things more resilient. So one common difference between what we're doing and things in nature is that they're a lot less resilient. So if I would cut off a leg of this robot, then it will likely not work anymore. Whereas I can give a kid all kinds of different bikes and will gradually learn how to control these bikes. So we as humans are able to learn from experience and change our behavior over time, whereas the things produced by artificial evolution, a lot of times they're a lot more brittle. So you change something very small and then they will not be able to adapt and then they will fail again. And so one way to change this is combine this artificial evolution with what we call plasticity. So in our brains, we are able to change the connections in our brain through experience by learning certain things. And this is something that hasn't really been done before that much in these artificial systems. So normally you create an artificial brain and it's static, so it does always the same thing. But by combining it with these local learning rules, you can actually allow them to change over time. And maybe an example here makes it simpler. So in this case, we actually see an artificial brain here while the agent navigates this maze. And this is an example that's also used for animal experiments. And the goal of this agent is to always navigate to the red reward. And at some point during its life, the reward will switch from this position, it just did, to this position. And then the agent has to remember, okay, last time I saw the reward in this part of the maze, so now I should go to the other side of the maze. So now it's switched again, so it will... start again. So now the red reward is on this side, now it's switched. So then the agent has to remember, okay, next time I should go to the other side of the maze because it's not at this side anymore. And to the left you see actually the artificial brain, and you see that the connections between these things are not static, so they're not always the same, but they actually change while the agent is navigating through this maze. And here you can do similar experiments that you do in nature, so you can look actually at the synaptic activity of this artificial brains and trying to figure out actually what this agent is doing while it's navigating this maze. And then in a different experiment we used a similar architecture. We trained evolution on just 3 different morphologies that just different in the length of the legs. So we have small legs, medium legs and large legs. And then we wanted to see if through this plasticity can they figure out to walk also for intermediate legs that they haven't seen during evolution. And it works for most of the times. They're able to extrapolate to different morphologies, but for this one it kind of it fits. So the last part, what we also wanted to find out if these CPBNs treatment if we can use these CPNs not to create, not to just create pictures and these artificial brains, but actually can we also make robot morphologies with the same kind of principles? And so this is, and we kind of made it extra challenging for us. We tried to make robot morphologies, or the question we had, can we make a complicated robot morphology out of a single piece of one-dimensional wire? So we have a one-dimensional piece of wire, and our artificial DNA tells us how we should fold this wire to get a robot structure out of it. And the benefit of doing it this way is that we can tell the computer to fold me a robot out of this one-dimensional piece of wire, and then if I don't want that robot anymore, for example, fold me a swimmer, I don't want it anymore, then you can recycle it and fold me something else. I want a walker, can you fold me a walker, and then I recycle it back. And then I want a climber, and it makes me a climber and recycles it back. So all these different robots are actually made from the same material, and that way they can be recycled. So it's similar in some sense to modular robotics, but kind of you try to outsource that process that makes this robot in this extra kind of vending machine. And so this is just a video of how it works in the simulation. So we have this vending machine that kind of bends this structure in a certain three-dimensional way that is determined by evolution, and these black things you see here is the motor. So once it's done with the bending process, it just puts it on the ground, and then it starts its brain up, and then it sees, is it able to walk? If it's not able, I throw it away, otherwise I make children based on this design and then repeat this process over and over. And so here's an example of what kind of weird structures evolution can come up with if we use these, for example, these CBPS, and you can see that again it is able to create things that are symmetric. And just made out of one piece of wire that has motors embedded in it in certain frequencies. And then we also currently are building a machine that can do this stuff in the physical world. So we have this bending machine that bends the wire, and then every once in a while we see a motor coming out, and then at the end it falls to the ground, and then it tries to move away. And so here we have it's very simple robots, but the idea was to explore, can you make something that is recyclable, and that if you don't want this robot anymore, then you can bend it, flatten it back out, and make a different robot out of it. So the last thing, what we're also interested in doing is what's called interactive evolution. So instead of having the computer just telling us, or instead of only being able to design a fitness function to make these things, we made this game to see what can people come up with if we let them do interactive evolution. So in this case, again, these flowers are made by these artificial CPPNs. So they have symmetry, they have a certain pattern. And then what users can do in this game called Petals is that they can breed these flowers. So you click on a flower, you get little baby flowers, then you can select the ones you like, you throw the other ones away, and over time you get more and more complex flowers, maybe more flowers that you personally prefer. And then you can also, because it runs on Facebook, you can trade these flowers with other people. Yeah, so it's a different example of what these kind of artificial evolutionary algorithms allow you to do. And then you can also print them in 3D, and then you can put them on your desktop. So Kasper is going to talk about, next slide, about this Flora Robotica project that combines some of these different aspects of evolution, robotics, and art. And I'm going to let Kasper do that. So just acknowledgement of some funding support that we have for these projects. And thank you very much for your attention.